Jesus told his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places." That's the 14th chapter of the Gospel according to John, the first and second verses. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. I'm extremely fortunate to have grown up in a family that believes those words and showed me what they mean by living the credo, "There is always room for one more." One way my parents manifested this belief was every time I got a new baby sister or brother. I'm the eldest of 4 children, and from the moment my parents shared the news with me that our family was growing, to the welcoming of the new family member, to making adjustments to having a new person in the household, my parents treated the growth as something that's just part of being a family. And we celebrated each new family member by making room for them. And sometimes that meant we had to give up some things. I remember it was particularly painful for me when my first sister was born, as I was no longer the only child, and my parents didn't have as much time to play just with me. While it was painful, I was shown that making space for my sister was better for my family, it was better for her, and it was even better for me to share attention and to learn how to help take care of her. Now, when my brother entered our family, I was able to help my sister through her discomfort when we had to make room for him. And by the time my youngest sister surprised us all by coming along unplanned, we were well practiced as siblings for making room. And my family didn't just make room for children. We had to make room for my dad's business when he decided to start his own plumbing business instead of working for someone else. That meant years of financial struggle, my dad having to leave for emergency calls, sometimes during family time. And we did spend some Saturdays and vacation times when other families were playing, helping my dad with minor tasks for his business. When my siblings got married, again, we had to step back and make room for their spouses. And each one brought changes to the family and how we gathered together. When I was ordained a priest, my family had to make room for my new responsibilities and role, which affected our family gatherings, especially for holidays like Christmas and Easter. And it isn't just people that my family has made room for. Throughout my life, and to this day, we continue to make room for stray cats, kittens, and dogs who come our way and become part of our family. We also learned how to make room for painful changes. When a grandparent or other family member died, we learned to make room for the absence their death brought to our family. It was an emptiness we couldn't fill, and we learned that loss is part of love. We learned to accept the pain of loss and make that loss part of our family, because without it, our family could never be whole. Some changes challenged our core belief. When my brother got divorced, it threw my family for a loop. They struggled with how to deal with his ex-wife. We had made room for her and included her in our family and wondered what we should do now that they were no longer married. And due to the circumstances of the divorce, I suggested that really she is still in relationship with us. It's just that the relationship has changed. And once we learn how to navigate the difference, we'll feel better about that change. These are just some of the ways that my parents not only formed our family, they were living what they believed and embodied the words of Jesus from today's gospel lesson. In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. These words are often read at funerals for the obvious comfort that they bring. And the author of John's Gospel did intend such comfort as Jesus spoke those words to his disciples when they were anxious about his departure, the departure he had just told them about. This is the part of John's Gospel when Jesus spoke his final words to his disciples before his crucifixion, death, and resurrection. It was something hard for them to understand, which is why Thomas asked how they could follow Jesus when they didn't know where he was going, and why Jesus spoke about his Father's house. Those words aren't just words of comfort. They are intended to help provide guidance for those wondering how to follow Jesus when Jesus isn't physically present and when things change drastically, which makes those words vitally necessary for us today, living in a time when there is a lot that we are uncertain about. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives, changed them very quickly, and has taken away from us so much of what we had come to depend on for our social, spiritual, mental, and physical well-being. We can ask, how can we worship when we can't be together and can't even be in our church building? As our senior warden wrote in a lovely letter to the parish last week, online worship just isn't the same as being together, and we shouldn't expect it to be. As hard as we clergy and other worship lay leaders try to provide some sort of spiritual comfort during this pandemic, it just isn't the same. Something is missing, and it's good to notice that absence, because that discomfort is pointing us back to the words of Jesus from today's gospel. When Jesus' disciples were troubled, when they weren't sure how to follow Jesus through a major change that would take him away from them, when a great big change was about to happen. And that is when Jesus spoke to them about his Father's house. Now, it's important to note that the word translated house in the gospel doesn't actually refer to a physical building. The word is better translated household or family. Jesus was talking about God's family, which means having many dwelling places isn't about providing literal rooms as much as it could mean that God's family, God and God's family members, make room. Similar to how my family makes room for people, pets, changes, losses, newness, and even uncertainties. And these aren't just words of comfort for when we die. They are words of hope for how followers of Jesus are to move forward through any circumstances, especially circumstances when we can't be certain, like this global pandemic. The author of the first letter of Peter in the epistle reading for today interpreted this concept as letting ourselves be built or formed into spiritual houses. Again, the author of the epistle isn't talking about literal bricks and mortar. They're talking about making room for the love of God. The author of the epistle was writing to a church going through major changes and struggling with uncertainty, and were trying to figure out a way to move through by renewing their identity in Christ, by making themselves into spiritual houses. People who make room for God and for others by making spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus. That's a lot of churchy words for making room, which means sometimes making room means making sacrifices, giving up things like attention or being certain or even some comforts. Making sacrifices can also mean making changes in our behaviors to accommodate the well-being of others. Right now, we're being asked to do this by sheltering in place, by not gathering in person for meetings and worship, wearing face masks when we do have to go out in public, and are being asked to give up some conveniences, all for the sake of others. Like the disciples, we might also be feeling uncertain about where God is during this pandemic. Is God sitting in our empty church building, waiting for us to return? Is God in our homes or in the hospitals with the people who are dying alone because visitors aren't permitted in hospitals or nursing homes? Is God with the people who want things just to go back to the way they used to be? Perhaps the answer is yes. Perhaps the answer is we don't know. Perhaps the answer is God is wherever room is being made for all of this. Here's another way to think about it. Several years ago, my mother and I were visiting Cornucopia, Wisconsin. That's a tiny little town farther north than Ashland or Bayfield. And the day we visited that town, there was a local fair going on with local vendors selling food, art, and crafts. My mother and I discovered the work of a local artist named Nancy Rayburn. And we enjoyed her work so much that I ended up buying my mother a print. And my mother bought me this print. I'm going to try to show it so you don't see the glare. The name of this print is Many Mansions. And what I appreciate about it is at first glance, you might think that God's house is below the top of the roof line. But if you look closer, you notice that there are house shapes everywhere, even up in the light. Which tells me that God's house is a lot bigger than we imagine, because God is continually making room. And if we look even closer, we can see what God is making room for. If you look, there are all different kinds of households. Households that appear to be happy or peaceful. And on the bottom here, if you can see, there are households that appear to be in crisis and even uncertainty. There's even empty spaces, which might be for loss. This print gives me a visual understanding of how God's love can make room for the reality of life, because healing and well-being first acknowledge the pain, the uncertainty, the fear, the loss, all of those things that can cause troubled hearts. And once the reality is acknowledged and room is made to grieve, healing can happen and life can be renewed. Which means if your heart is troubled, there's room for you in God's family, because there is room for what is troubling you, and there is room for healing, growth, and change. And if you look close, you can see that the dwelling places all look like houses in this print. And this reminds me of the advice of the author today's epistle gave for us about letting ourselves be formed into spiritual houses. And together, all our spiritual houses can make room for God's love and all the stuff of life. Now, this doesn't in any way condone bad or harmful behavior, but it does acknowledge the hurt that kind of behavior causes, and then can make room for forgiveness, healing, growth. And that is the stuff of hope that Jesus was talking about in the gospel. Hope is how we can make room for God's love in others as we move forward in uncertain times. Hope is how we follow Jesus. Hope is how we can become spiritual houses by making room for one more. That's how we can show God's love to the world, because love is the stuff that God's household, God's family, is made of.